friends, it's Binge O'Clock, the podcast where we watch something and then we talk about it. I'm Joy Selden, and I've seen almost everything.
I'm Danielle, and I've seen almost nothing.
And we need to start right here at the top to let you listeners know we were remiss in leaving out a piece of our beautiful synth pride last week. It was such a lovely moment, and I can't believe we missed it.
And something that they introduced language into the show that I have taken with me through the episode after it and will continue taking with me for every episode after that, which is Kennex looking at Dorian and saying, "Hey, what's with the disco face?"
Disco face! Disco face!
When Dorian's little blue doo-doo-doo-doo come on.
There's a part of me that wants to believe that could also technically be a label for their ship name.
Disco face? No.
Look, I can dream, dang it.
I mean, but disco face is probably going to be how I refer to the blue dealio going on whenever Dorian processes something moving forward, because how could I not?
You know, I was just talking about him turning on a processor, but at the same time, I'm like, no. It is actually disco face.
Disco face!
This was the word that I was missing from my vocabulary.
And we've been gifted that word.
And this week, we're talking about episode 4, which was titled The Bends. In an effort to thwart a big player in the street drug scene, Kennex has the idea to put Rudy, poor Rudy, undercover as a cook to try to put this man away. And it all takes place within 24 hours.
Within 24 hours.
And that's it. That's the show. The episode starts with poor Rudy in a very tense moment, and then it cuts to 24 hours sooner. And I'm like, oh no.
Oh, of
not
course.
my boy.
But they had to have at least one episode where they did that, quote, tension building 24 hours earlier. And this was that episode. But they should have changed the title screen to 48 hours. What if it said 48 hours, Joy?
What if it said 48 hours? 48 hours definitely would have been better, I think. My poor Rudy.
Rudy. Okay, before we talk about Rudy, we have to ask the eternal question. Joy, what weren't the police prepared for this week?
I feel like the police just keep shooting themselves in the foot. No pun intended. The theme continues sort of from last week, right? Where the police were more or less unprepared for the criminal element, knowing what they were going to do. And this week, the police are completely unprepared for the corruption within the police force, which maybe that's the 400% we were looking for all along. We found it. I mean, I guess this is also where you understand that Maldonado is like, Kennex is the only one I trust.
Yes.
Because, wow.
Wow. Yes.
But there were actual legit tech pieces, which we should go over.
For sure.
The Bends is actually a reference to a new street drug, which I know this isn't quite tech because, you know, street drugs are street drugs. But it's like an algae that they found in the ocean, and It's been synthesized.
They use the algae to synthesize benzopropion. The Benz, it comes from the ocean. So clever.
Where have these writers been all my life? Look at them go. No, I'm kidding. No, I do actually really enjoy the writing in this scene. And I enjoy the idea that it's like, this is technically an organic substance that, you know, that this drug was made from, because a lot of drugs are made from the earth.
Well, granted, I think, you know what? I feel like the show hand-waved this a bit, because the Benz has recently become really popular, but they specifically say that it was difficult to produce because it's difficult to harvest from the ocean, but then they, quote, found a way to mass produce it. So I think that maybe the new street version is actually purely synthesized and maybe not the organic that it once was.
No, but that's actually a very good point, because as we will see later, Rudy is able to cook this up in a lab.
Exactly.
Without having any of it.
So I don't think it's organic anymore, even though it used to be. Though it is notoriously addictive, and now the police are facing an epidemic.
An epidemic within 24 hours. It's fine.
24 hours.
we'll get to that. There was recently a movie, I think, called Eight Bridges, which was like when when Manhattan was like locked from the rest of the boroughs.
No, it was like 20 odd bridges.
21 bridges.
Okay.
Was actually the name of it. And it's actually like, Chadwick Boseman is in it. Like it's a well acted action film. The premise of it is complete bonkers. And this is how I felt watching this episode. This all happened within a 24-hour period. Like, you're telling me they got the drugs that night and they somehow got it to their street people to somehow get it back on the street, to somehow have like up to 20, I think it was like 25 people OD on this thing, and 5 people
little
die.
Side scene with the teens who are like, "Wake up, buddy, wake up!" And the teen isn't waking up. They're like, "Oh, we OD'd."
It took too much. And look, it's not funny, but at the same time, I can't. The physics aren't there.
It's not funny, but it's the way they cut it in that made it funny.
It's the way they cut it in, and also the way it's like both day and nighttime at the same time, and you never have any idea what time of day it is. Give me 3 days, 4 days maybe. Anything.
I would take
But we
a
should
week.
be talking about tech.
We should be talking about tech. Okay, wait. So another piece of tech we should talk about on the criminal side is that we have a new type of bot introduced in this episode.
We do.
We do. We were first able to identify the bot as different because the bot's disco face lights up purple as opposed to the
Which is a
red
disco
of the,
color I can get behind.
Exactly. As opposed to the red of the MXs and the blue of the DRN series. So this is a VX bot.
Yes. We definitely get this new color, and he is just a very different bot. Like, he looks stronger and sturdier, and I got bouncer vibes.
For sure. I mean, he straight uses himself as a human shield at the end of the episode. And I know we were talking about this pre-recording, but, the number of shots he's able to take unscathed is very different than the number of shots, say, Dorian took in the heist episode previous to this, where, he took 50 shots and survived, but those 50 shots had him on the floor. And this bot doesn't react in that way.
Definitely not. You can't even see this bot get hit.
It didn't even, honestly, Joy, it didn't even make holes in his shirt. And that really annoyed me.
If you're gonna be a human shield, actually shield me from some bullets here.
Well, he was, but his shirt should have had holes in it.
Or is his titanium chest, like, just that impressive? I don't know. Is the shirt made of palladium? I don't know. It could have been.
Yeah, but, so it's a bulky bot with a purple disco face. He can also do a full body scan to find subcutaneous wires and instant lab work.
Instant lab work.
Yeah.
He drinks the drug to understand what's in it, which I was like, that feels weirdly analog considering that we've seen Dorian, like, inject himself.
Oh, true. Stick a finger in things and just kind of... But again, to your point, Joy, I agree. I don't think that this bot was ever a police issue. It does seem like this bot was developed by the 400%.
Is that like the 98%? We're just going to start calling them the 400%. The criminal element.
The criminal
also known
element.
as the 400%. For sure.
Now,
we don't even get a lot of character development for him also, which also gives me kind of bouncer vibes.
Yeah,
He's very direct to the point. He knows what his job is, and he's also like part bodyguard.
he knows what his job is until the end of the episode when his head and entire spine are severed from the rest of his body. That was a very intense 2 seconds of TV.
So Dorian and this bot get into this fight, and it's very obvious that Dorian is outmatched pretty quickly. Like, he's landing these blows, but they're not doing a whole lot. You get the impression as he's bobbing and weaving that if this other bot hits him, it's going to be really bad. And sure enough, he connects and, like, throws him halfway across the room, which, yikes.
Yikes.
And he, Dorian has to eventually fight him smart, which is, you're, like, trying to get me close to some kind of electrical charge something, but, we happen to be in a warehouse and there's a hook. just manages somehow to, like, get up inside the base of his skull and, like, lift him up off the ground. And because he's such a reinforced bot, I imagine that's why his body is so heavy and it just drags the rest of it down. And his head is still on the spike. And there's a level of, like, how horrifying, right?
Oh, I know.
But at the same time, weirdly comical.
Weirdly comical and oddly satisfying. Just because it was so clean. It was just little, like, whoop, and there it was, the spine.
I didn't expect this to happen, but here we are.
I really wasn't.
And we definitely don't endear ourselves to this bot at all.
No.
I would argue this is the first bot that I've actually, like, hated on the show. Mm-hmm. You know, like the MX series, I don't really hate them because, like, the same way I wouldn't hate a logic machine, like, it's just doing its job. I definitely didn't hate the sex bots.
Yeah.
I love Dorian. And this bot was just like, wow, you don't deserve to exist. And there's a part of me that feels bad for saying that. But you're mean.
Yeah, mean and really, really just there to do distasteful things.
Yes. This is a bot that is built for the baddies.
Yes.
And he does not hide that.
Nope. Well, wait, before we go into the next thing, I think the other half of the tech question, which is the tech question of what weren't the police prepared for this week, is I think this week we do get to see the police try to use some of the technology themselves. Some of it fails miserably, like the subcutaneous wire, for example, never a good idea. When literally everyone has handheld body scanners.
Or an android behind them who can see a thing.
Well, in whose mind was that going to be effective? Also, what did poor Cooper have to go through to get that implanted? I don't even want to think about it.
No, we're not going to think about it.
We get the surveillance roaches, right?
The surveillance roaches. I feel like those are, like, it's always my favorite thing when somebody makes, like, a little roach that's also a surveillance device. Because it's like, oh, finally, like, a useful roach that you would never step on.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to me that the baddies don't pick up on the surveillance roaches in that scene, but okay, fine.
Yeah. I think the element of surveillance roaches, which I've seen in other science fiction, like Fifth Element comes to mind. There's other stuff that's like using a bug to actually be a bug, which is great. You know, like, I don't know why you wouldn't do that. I don't know why every single roach wouldn't be a surveillance roach. But I think having it in, like, this seedy warehouse, they're not really paying attention to the roaches, which is also a primo choice for that option.
Primo. And then we get the GPS solvent that the police department is beta testing, which makes Rudy's, after Rudy drinks it, gives him indigestion and some gas issues, but also makes his whole body an undetectable GPS locator and tracking beacon.
Poor Rudy.
Rudy. Is that a good segue into?
That might be a good segue into poor Rudy, because he's also a nerd and sort of meant to be, like, as a secondary, like, foil for everybody, but also part comedy. Mm-hmm. Like, we've seen him be kind of funny before. And I'm just like, of course you gave him the fart jokes.
Yeah.
Of course you did.
Of course you did. Thankfully, it's not the only joke they give him. He gets a lot of really great one-liners.
He does. He gets a lot of I think you said you have, like, a whole page of, like, the things Rudy said.
Yes. Very close to it.
The Rudy of it all is Rudy is thrown. Well, okay. First of all, Kennex, like, has this idea of, like, well, if the bad guy is just looking for a cook, then we'll just make Rudy do it, right? Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Wait, Joy, maybe you should mention Kennex's first suggestion when they were looking for a cook.
Yes, okay, so Kennex's first suggestion. And from a context, like, Kennex's friend has died. Which we get in the first scene. So he's a little out of his element. And he basically goes to Maldonado and is like, I think I should be the cook that we send into this because... And Maldonado was like, I understand you want to avenge your friend, but this isn't how you do it. And he's like, no, this isn't about that. He's looking for a cook. I could be that cook. And Maldonado goes, you can't even cook ramen, let alone the Bens. And without missing a beat, Kennex is just like, hey, I can cook ramen. Well, I can order ramen.
Which is then when we get to Maldonado finally saying, no, we need someone with a background in chemistry and someone who is so good that they can fool the bishop. And Kennex goes, I've got just the guy.
And Rudy is working on some poor robot's head. A very snarky robot.
Very.
I'm just like, are you police issue? Because you feel your circuits are way crossed, buddy. But yeah, he's working on a robot and he's like, oh, that sounds great. And instantly, like every single nerd I have ever known is just like, I get to be an undercover cool gangster.
Yes. What? Oh, I've got some ideas about my alter ego. He's going to be sophisticated, European. I love that he's looking into some kind of pan off to the side as a mirror and kind of envisioning what his face is going to look like.
Yes. He has thought about this. He has played video games, I'm sure of it, where he is the bad guy. He knows exactly the kind of person he's going to be. And of course, the police are like, we need to pull that back a little bit, buddy.
And so
he wears a fedora.
His hat.
The hat.
The hat. And so, well, the way they get him to pull back a little bit is by getting him in a room with Valerie and Richard Paul, the worst human on the planet. Well, I suppose with the exception of the actual murderers and criminals in this show.
Currently the worst policeman that we have to spend a lot of time with. Richard Paul.
Oh, Richard Paul.
I know you hate his name.
I hate his name so much. And the reason I hate it is that in the pilot, they made his name Richard and called him the prick, and it was the one half joke the pilot had. And then in episode 2, they almost retcon it. They don't even announce it. Everyone starts calling him Paul. And suddenly he's Detective Paul. What?
Detective Paul.
What?
I feel like maybe Valerie is the only one that's like allowed to call him Richard. Maybe everybody else calls him Detective Paul.
Yeah, no, she definitely calls him Richard in this episode when she's trying to admonish him for, I don't know, he took a step too far at some point. I can't remember precisely what he did.
Look, it's kind of a blur of everything he does for us because we don't like him very much.
No, and he's super mean to Rudy / Callum Waits.
He is. Callum Waits. Look, he knows his vice, he knows his undercover, he knows his police work. We've seen him actually do some of his police work, so we can't exactly say he's a quote-unquote bad cop. But, like, he's definitely coming at it from a place of knowing exactly what the bad guys are going to think and do, which makes him very perfect to talk to Rudy. And while I didn't enjoy the moment, in order to reinforce Rudy's backstory, he sort of roughs him up a little bit. And I'm like, but yeah, the bad guys probably will rough you up a little bit. Like, you should be prepared for not a very nice, like, so where were you born?
Did he have to do it that way, though? Literally slam his entire head down on a table to rough... that was a step too far. I'm pretty sure Valerie agrees with me. And Valerie's the smartest person on this show.
Team Valerie. Team Valerie all the way. I feel like Richard Paul comes from a military background. I get military vibes off Richard Paul, which is not a bad thing. Yeah. It's just the way he approaches things.
He's very effective. Well, let's get back to Rudy, because we were going to talk about Rudy, and now we've talked about Richard for 6 minutes.
I know. And we'll never get those 6 minutes back. But yes, Rudy. So Rudy is preparing, and he also tries to cook, which the first time doesn't go very well. And, like, thank goodness there was an MX in the room, because it, like, a piece comes off the equipment and, like, takes out the MX's eye. And he's like, I guess I forgot the iodine. And, like, the MX is just kind of staring at him with one eye. But it's an MX, so it's fine. He'll fix it later.
And, once he's ready and he's got his disguise together, it's time for him to actually enter the heart of the criminal enterprise.
He's so ready. So he swallows this GPS signal and gets a little bit of intestinal distress. And then he goes in to basically meet the bishop. And he thinks he kind of has, right? Like, a guy kind of comes out of the shadows, and this guy was maybe alluded to as to being the bishop in the first scene. He endears himself to them in the hardest way. Well, actually, first he does not. First He says his real name when they ask him what his name
The
is.
very first thing out of his mouth is, I'm Rudy. I mean, Callum Randolph Waits, Rudy for short.
The cops listening to this are like, what? Did he just say his name?
They all do the equivalent of just like throwing their hats on the ground. Oh, seriously, man? So actually, Dorian gets to come in and save him. Like, I think that Dorian opens up the opportunity for Rudy to actually endear himself to the baddies, because Dorian gets in, and I love that Dorian walks in and also calls him the wrong name.
Calls him Dolph, which in my brain is like, wait, so you don't even call him Rudy, because if his name is Rudolph, you call him Dolph. And there's a moment where I'm like, I kind of love that in the weirdest way. And like, I imagine this is how Dorian himself like reprograms his brain to be like, no, if this dude corrected you, you probably wouldn't call him Rudy, right? Like, you'd call him something else. And I'm just like, the mental backflips Dorian had to do before going in there and is somehow convincing.
Well, so then Rudy says, so Rudy endears himself, a little bit more to the baddies by saying that he found Rudy on the black market and completely refurbished him. Come on,
Found
we've all
Dorian
got
on the
bots
black
here.
market.
Yeah, found Dorian on the black market.
Yeah.
Come on, we've all got bots here, and then finally we're all cool.
And yeah, we've all got bots here because you guys have your like Terminator bot.
And I have my DRN series.
And I have my DRN series, with like noticeably smaller than yours. Like my petite versus your double XL. Not that Dorian doesn't have his positives. As we've said, Dorian comes out better in that fight, but still.
Yep.
He's like, he is slammed up against the wall by this bot, and you know, there's a moment where it's like, hey, you forgot your glasses, which I think is also very precious.
Yes. Totally agreed.
So then he starts cooking, and he has 2 minutes.
I love that the whole scene where he's cooking, there's literally a tick, 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 tick going through the background.
Yeah, no, they knew what they were doing. They set this up really well. And there's a part of me that imagines that this is the android making the ticking noise because you want them under pressure.
Yep.
Although I'm sure it's probably just for the audience's benefit. Now, to rewind a little bit, when we first get introduced to this drug, the first cook makes it to, was it 83%?
84% pure. And everyone was astounded.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, Rudy cooks this and makes 95% pure and says one of the most precious lines. You probably have it written down. I don't want to mangle it.
He says, get ready to taste perfection. And then once they determine it's 95% pure, he goes, this cook is now a chef.
Chef Rudy. Chef Callum Rudolph Waits. Rudy for short.
Rudy for short.
And you know, he kind of hits his stride a little bit, you know, and he does what the cops were sort of telling him to do, right? Like, he tries to get the guy talking. He tries to ask about the codename Bishop. He tries to get even closer. And the guy who we think is the Bishop,
yes,
but we're not sure. But again, the show does the foreshadowing thing. He hasn't actually confirmed he's the Bishop or not. Literally hands him what looks like a plastic shot glass and is like, drink this.
Yep.
And Rudy's like, I'm having some stomach issues, which, by the way, is hilarious because that's totally true.
Totally true.
Like, you guys witnessed it. You heard the gurgle.
And it turns out that the little shot is the counteragent to the GPS solvent. So suddenly, the GPS locator and the tracking beacon are moot.
And to their credit, Kennex realizes what happened and doesn't waste any time at all, and rushes right in. But they've already taken Callum / Rudy / Dolph away from there and brought him to Site B, where the real Bishop is, who is a captain on the police force in a different district.
Which I guess is the reason he doesn't recognize Rudy, but still was a little odd to me.
I don't know. Well, again, I imagine Rudy as like in the basement of a department of a something, right? Like he works in a warehouse with a bunch of bot parts. He's not really on site. Like he could be on site if he needs to, but I imagine him sort of removed from everybody.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if Rudy recognizes him either to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And listeners at home, we were introduced to him in one of the first few scenes of the episode, I think in the first like 10 or 15 minutes, because it's his officer who shows up dead, and he has to show up to Maldonado and be like, we kind of want to keep this quiet because, you know, a crooked cop starts to raise questions. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, you're just trying to keep it quiet because you're the one who's trying to get the drug onto the market. Yep. And he basically tells Maldonado that like, hey, you know, this is my boy. Anything shows up, please let me know as soon as you find out. So once they realize, hey, they were able to neutralize that GPS signal, which means they're a cop because nobody knows we're working on that. That is brand new, fresh off of R&D. I think even Rudy even says like it's still in testing.
Yeah, it's beta testing. Mm-hmm.
Beta testing. So as soon as that happens, they instantly know it's a cop. Who else would have access to the neutralizing agent? Mm-hmm. Basically, they're like, what's the connection? They do some police work, and they're like, well, the guy who... Oh, this was another tech thing that's, like, part of Dorian's superpower, I think, is that I think Dorian can, like, project the video feed from his eyes to the police precinct.
Yeah, I mean...
Or is it in the glasses?
That part was a little unclear to me, and here's why. Because before Dorian went in, he on purpose turned off his comms. He shut down his comm relays so that the baddies wouldn't detect any outgoing transmissions. And yet when he gets there, is able to scan the faces of the people who are there and send them to the police department so that the police department can identify the people who are in the warehouse. Or wait, maybe they got those scans from the surveillance roaches.
Maybe they got those scans from the surveillance.
It's not really clear. It's not really clear, but they do get scans, and they are able to identify some faces. They identify one of the baddies as someone who, even on IMDb, is only marked as Cruz. And that person was originally...
He gets a name in the show. IMDb couldn't even give him his first name. Aww. No. It went by so fast. It's a 24-hour period. It goes by so fast. Nobody knows anybody's name.
He was released from prison when he shouldn't have been, and the person who signed the release form was Barros.
Yes. The captain who is corrupt. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of how they make that connection of just like, well, it's got to be him, because why would a police captain like release some low-level street drug peddler?
100%.
And so
we are getting swamped in summary at this point, though.
We are. I know. Just real quick, though, because Maldonado does something really awesome. I think this is where Rudy realizes who he is. Mm-hmm. Rudy finally knows who he is because he gets a call from Captain Maldonado. And the guy actually says, Captain Maldonado, how are you? And I was like, I feel like this is where Rudy actually recognizes him. And they talk a little bit. Basically, Maldonado is just trying to track where the guy is. Mm-hmm. But to get back to Rudy, Captain Barros then says, well, you know, how were you able to get the percentage so high? Like, that no one's been able to do that. And then Rudy has a beautiful speech about passion. And enjoying what you work and letting your work have a life of its own and letting your work speak to you. And meanwhile, I'm like, you work on robots that literally speak to you.
Yes. He actually uses the bot as an example in his speech. Take your bot, for instance, you know?
And this is where I know you were very mad that Rudy actually took a piece of Richard's advice.
Mad. Because this was such a great moment for Rudy, but also this was Rudy taking Richard's advice. Because Richard told him that when you are in a moment and you do not know what to do, make your lies as close to the truth as possible. And this is the truth. Rudy approaches his work with reverence, pours his very soul into it. His work takes on a life of its own, and he becomes, quote, very fond of that creation.
And you know, there's a moment where I'm just like, oh, Dorian isn't even here to like hear his words.
Yeah.
And I do feel a little sad about that, but it's fine. Dorian knows. So things go sideways pretty quickly, and Rudy gets shot.
Yes. But thankfully, the Maldonado's call was effective. They tracked the call that Maldonado made. So the police force shows up. Everything is fine. Kennex takes out the terrible captain. And Dorian takes out the android, which we already discussed at the top of the episode. Which brings us to the closing scene of this episode. When there is a change of plans, we're going to McQuaid's.
And Kennex is like, what do you mean? No, McQuaid's is my bar. What are you talking about? And Dorian has to be like, well, I promised Rudy we would take him out for, you know, a celebratory whatever. And Rudy gets in, and he's like a kid at Christmas, and he's so excited.
So excited. Kennex can't say no to Rudy because of his face. Like, I'll take you guys to McQuaid's.
I like to think that Kennex is that, like, older kid who hangs out with some younger kids and, like, ultimately protects them from other bullies, but, like, doesn't really want to be seen with them.
Yes. You know? A genuine cup bar. We can drink martinis. We'll be drinking beers.
We'll be drinking beers. Also, I don't know you. I'm taking you there, but I don't know you.
I do also like that this whole scene when Kennex is running through those rules that you have to follow to be cool in the bar, Dorian is literally nodding at every rule. So I kind of feel like Dorian was also benefiting from this explanation.
Seems legit.
Yeah, okay, all right. Don't talk about test tubes. Don't embarrass Kennex. Don't...
I feel like Dorian was Rudy's wingman that night, and it was fine. And I feel like even Kennex, like, I feel like even they enjoyed a drink at the end of the night, maybe when the bar was like not as populated.
You know what? That's a good point. I agree with you. I think that Dorian also did some pretty wild things in this episode, particularly when he realized Rudy was in danger. You know, like when Dorian twists this mook's neck to kill whoever that person was. I don't even know who it was.
Cruz.
And
he
then
doesn't even blink. He just twists the guy's neck, and that's it.
Cruz is the one who got shot in the knee, and then Dorian is like digging his fingers into the hole to try and get Cruz to talk. So Rudy gets pretty intense.
It's not Cruz. It's like Rudy, Mook number 3.
Dorian gets really intense.
Dorian gets very protective of Rudy very quickly. But yeah, that's essentially Rudy's. This is Rudy's adventure, everyone. I would have loved to have played this in the video game of Almost Human.
Oh, yeah.
I would play as Rudy all the time.
Kind of that side scene. You know, being that we're talking about Dorian, I feel like that's a pretty good segue to our moment, and it will be a moment because there wasn't a lot of it in this episode, but our moment to discuss synth pride.
Synth pride.
Or our robotic hearts.
There were a few
moments.
We didn't get nearly as many as Skin or even the last episode.
Yeah.
This episode was definitely dedicated to Rudy. I feel like there was some off-screen moments between. We'll just have to fix that in fic. It's fine.
It's okay. I mean, I'm not upset that Rudy got a chance to shine, but Robotic Hearts was definitely a bit on the back burner here.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to what you were talking about where, like, Dorian has moods. And I think in this one, he's also not standoffish, but he definitely has moods. Like, Kennex, when we see them, they're eating in a restaurant, and Kennex is, like, taking his time, enjoying his food. And meanwhile, Dorian is like, could we get back to work, please? Like, what are you doing?
I mean, when he speaks to Nuri, is that the name of this person who owned the restaurant? I think so. But when he speaks to him, he says that John looks like a man, but unfortunately eats like a cow. Rude.
So rude.
Then we get our cabin scene.
Cabin. Oh, he's so mean here.
He's so mean at the cabin.
Kennex says something along the lines of, like, if I owned a cabin, I'd probably kill myself. And then Dorian says, you should get a cabin.
What?
Why?
Rude. Oh, man.
And then, but even then, like, I think so. Like, this also establishes like Dorian is obviously not a mean person.
Yeah.
Because later, you know, there's a moment of like, well, we should put a protective detail on the girlfriend of the cop who died. Mm-hmm. And Dorian finishes Kenneck's sentence and like completely understands and like calls it in immediately. And does Kennex actually thank him?
He says, thank you, man. And Dorian responds by saying, you're welcome, my friend.
But then Kennex is just like, I guess we're friends now in this weird, like, dismissal.
Yeah, great. Now we're friends. And Dorian gets this look on his face, which, but, you know, despite whatever friction is between them personally, to your point about them basically speaking in sync about that protection agent, they are extremely effective partners. And there are a lot of great moments in this episode where they communicate without communicating.
Yes.
And they just know what each person is supposed to do in any given moment. So we get that.
We do.
If that's at all positive.
It's positive. Again, this episode was not about them.
Yeah.
I do think there's a level of between partners and understanding when one of you is kind of surly. The other one sometimes has to take that on to almost prove themselves to the other partner. Mm-hmm. And as a person who is not surly myself, it's hard to sometimes understand where that bonding actually happens. Mm. Like, I don't think Kennex is like, that was mean. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like Kennex is like, there's a level of respect at, like, the nonsense that Dorian throws at him.
You know what? Yes, you're absolutely right. Because even at his meanest, when Dorian says, you should buy a cabin, John's response is just cute. You want to walk home?
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
You know? Like, if we're gonna be this way, whatever. You know, like, he's not even hurt.
No.
He's not even hurt by that.
You're right. So they work well together.
I think they work well together. It's not always the relationship I understand, but I get it on some level. Like, I understand that can work. I just don't actually understand how that can work. Mm-hmm. Oh, God, does that bring us to our one more thing?
Our one more thing. If we could each talk about one more thing in this episode, what would we want to talk about? And Joy and I have a mutual one more thing.
Yes. As soon as this happened... Well, first of all, I watched it before Danielle, and I was like, oh, wait, I can't spoil anything.
No.
But once Danielle watched it,
your
first response was, how are you in a Japanese restaurant and you still haven't ordered noodles?
There are bowls, there are chopsticks, you already, you know what, we're putting it aside. We don't need the noodle update this week. But Joy and I both had the same reaction to that scene independently, and then we're messaging each other about it afterwards.
Yes, and my instant reaction was, how dare you? But basically the scene is they're both in a Japanese restaurant, and you bring up something very factual, which is it is considered rude not to finish the food on your plate in Japanese society. Now, when Dorian makes the comment about Kennex's stomach being like a cow's, he says something else in Japanese that is not translated, and the chef puts in front of Kennex a live slug for him to eat.
Yep.
And I lost it. I was so mad because there's, and you pointed this out also, there's a level of American where we're like, it's an Asian cuisine, therefore it must be super gross and weird. And here's a slug that's moving around. It's perfectly alive. There's a difference between raw and alive.
There's a huge difference between raw and alive. And, you know, when we were discussing it, I think that this was one of the moments in the episode where you realize and remember that the show was made in 2013. Because in 2013, at least in my experience, Asian food on screen was solidly through Fear Factor type shows, or shows where some person is traveling to a country and eating, quote, weird foods. And so things like century eggs will be put in front of people, or balut. And they'll say, oh, Filipino food, have you ever eaten balut? And everyone just goes, this is disgusting. And they're like, opening up the egg and talking about how it smells like a shoe that's been in the garbage for 3 days. Gross, And this just fit right in with the rest of that.
Yeah, it conjures that moment of this is disgusting because it's foreign.
Yep. On top of which, live slugs are not even actually a part of Japanese cuisine.
I know. And I even spoke to you about this also because, they happen to pick a culture that I am surprisingly familiar with. So, had they said something else, some other Asian culture of this is Korean or this is Vietnamese, I might not have been able to have that knee jerk, they don't do that.
Uh-huh.
Wait. And you and I even talked about this too, where there is a kind of cuisine in Japanese culture where you serve something immediately after it has been killed. And because it's a fish or an octopus or a squid, it will have the appearance of being alive, or it will have some physical attribute of the impression that it is alive, but it is not in fact alive. And my brain went, you still didn't do that with a slug. It's not like you made slug sashimi.
Yeah.
Which is, again, a level of, before refrigeration, how did you prove to your patrons that this was a fresh kill? This is how you proved that this was a fresh kill. And it's a very artfully done sort of presentation of the meal. At least that you understand a level of that appears to be alive, in quotation marks. And this was just, literally a slug that this man put on a plate.
An alive slug. Good job.
What happens in 27 years that Japanese folk are just here's a live slug, enjoy.
Ridiculous. Well, I'm sad that we had to end the episode on that as a one more thing.
Just so that we don't have to end on quite such a dour note, I think you'll be very excited about the next episode, because this is finally something I remember is all this time, Kennex has been keeping Dorian waiting. In the very next episode, Dorian keeps Kennex waiting for about 15 minutes.
I'm so excited! I can't wait for the tables to turn.
I think you'll enjoy it. So there you go.
All right. Until then, or between now and then, we would love to hear from you. Please check us out at Binge O'Clock Pod on Twitter and Facebook, where you can answer the question, if you had a disco face, what color would it be? You can also email us your answers at bingeoclockpod@gmail.com.
And be sure to tell your friends, tell your family, tell your loved ones, tell the nerds in your life about Binge O'Clock, and we will see you next time.